doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.
Dear friends and partners, it's a genuine pleasure to be a champion and part of this COP27 Just Transition Investors Alliance, JTIA, initiative launch. As you know, it's led by the Africa Union Development Agency, the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, Africa Investor, the International Chamber of Commerce, the African Green Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the World Benchmarking Alliance. I applaud your leadership with the timely conception and launch of this transformative institutional investor-public partnership leadership platform. Fellow leaders, we're all painfully aware that Africa is already facing more severe climate change impacts than most other parts of the world, despite bearing the least responsibility for the problem. With nearly 1/5 of the world's population today, Africa accounts for less than 3% of the world's energy-related carbon dioxide emissions to date, and has the lowest emissions per capita of any region. Africans are already disproportionately experiencing the negative effects of climate change, including water stress, reduced food production, increased frequency of extreme weather events, and lower economic growth, all of which are fueling mass climate migration internally in Africa and externally, and also climate displaced people. Over 640 million Africans don't have access to energy, corresponding to an electricity access rate for African countries at just over 40%, the lowest in the world, with clean cooking only reaching 1/3 of the continent, with approximately 890 million Africans, and of course, mainly women, cooking with traditional fuels. On the climate finance side, Africa needs to mobilize $3 trillion for its nationally determined contribution projects by 2030, while the world only mobilized 2.8 trillion for renewable energy investments in the last 20 years, between 2000 and 2020, of which Africa only received 2% of that global sum. So this means that Africa has to mobilize more climate finance and investment in the next 8 years than the world mobilized in the last 20 years. And of course, it still grapples with securing the unmet promised 100 billion per year of adaptation and mitigation finance from industrialized countries. On the international trade front, Africa's access to global value chains sits at an inequitable and unacceptable 2% of global trade, which is predominantly for the commercial exploitation of African raw materials and minerals, where value is added outside the continent and sold at high premium as finished goods globally, and also, of course, back into Africa. In our interconnected and interdependent world, these are painful realities that need to be practically addressed. Not only for Africa to meet its climate goals, but in recognition that if Africa doesn't meet its climate goals, the world as a whole won't meet its climate goals. We needn't remind ourselves that a central tenet of the just energy transition enshrined in the Paris Agreement is that economic benefits must be shared equitably, and the responsibility and costs for climate action must be absorbed by those who have contributed most to the climate breakdown. And as we gather in support of a successful COP27 presidency, a just transition will be at the heart of all discussions and negotiations. Business and human rights, market access, global procurement and place-based impact investment decisions to access the new $10 trillion per annum and growing global green industrial economy are powerful tools within our control to equitably lift millions of Africans out of poverty with dignity, especially the most vulnerable in carbon industry intensive places and geographies, such as mining towns and cities that will imminently become stranded destinations with the phase down and out of these industries, inhabited by local communities dependent on those same carbon-intensive industries for their livelihoods. So I applaud and I welcome the innovative approach of the Just Transition Investors Alliance, JTIA, being that it's founded on an overarching theory of change. And it's important for us not to understate Africa's abundant and incredibly valuable asset base through its in-demand natural capital, sun, wind, hydro, especially for green hydrogen, for example. Also, its superior endowment of key mineral resources, critical for the green technologies that will drive the global transition, along with its land and, of course, its young human capital that's available aplenty. This all means that Africa's investment case is clear to those who care to want to find it. So I urge you all to find ways to be part of and support this Just Transition Investors Alliance. And I personally look forward to working with each of you to drive the success of this initiative and see that no one gets left behind. So once again, warm congratulations on this launch and all the best in its implementation. Thank you.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.